Tony Blair bows out as Baghdad burns and Belfast celebrates. We take a look at Blair's successes, failures and unfulfilled promises and where that leaves the rest of us. This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Jane Dutton. So, Tony Blair has resigned as British Prime Minister. But what has he left behind? Well, on the home front, he lays claim to better healthcare and a robust economy. But what about his government's impact on the world? The most obvious example and the most disastrous is Tony Blair's decision to join the US-led invasion of Iraq. The discovery that, no, Saddam Hussein did not possess weapons of mass destruction was a blow from which his government never recovered. The popular opposition to the war and his close relationship to the Bush White House was deafening. Still, in his resignation speech Thursday, Blair kept that course, saying Britain should still see Iraq through. Hand in hand with his decision to go to war in Iraq was Blair's promise to tackle the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. However, with just a few short weeks to go, Blair's no closer to a deal. Also on the foreign policy front, however, is the long-laboured question of Northern Ireland. As Richard Martin reports, Blair can count that as a success.
It was a remarkable success. Sworn enemies sitting down together in government, bridging a bitter religious and cultural divide that claimed thousands of lives. Many credit Blair's patient diplomacy and years of effort. It was a policy triumph for a Prime Minister in his final days in office. But in his final months, Blair also promised progress in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process.
And it's a critical time for all of us who want to see progress, and we want to see progress because people are indeed suffering.
And here there are a precious few signs of a Northern Ireland-style breakthrough. Last year, his failure to condemn Israel's invasion of Lebanon attracted widespread criticism, even from within the ranks of his own ministers. Stung by accusations of pro-Israeli bias, Blair pledged to work for Middle East peace and to devote his final year in power to brokering a deal.
There is an arc of extremism now stretching across the Middle East and touching with increasing definition countries far outside that region.
In a key autumn foreign policy speech, he made a plea to President Bush to acknowledge that a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict lies at the heart of any chance of wider Middle East peace.
A whole region policy should start with Israel-Palestine. That is the core.
But that plea seems to have fallen on deaf ears. For all the Camp David love-ins and the damage done to his premiership by backing Bush in Iraq, Blair leaves office with no claim to success in making peace in the Middle East.
Joining us now are our guests. Tim Gore works for the FABIAN Society, a left-of-centre think tank in Britain. Alistair Crook joins us from Beirut and is the director of the Conflicts Forum. And finally, from London, political analyst JIHAD AL-KHAZEN. Mr. Crook, Tony Blair will want, I should imagine, history to judge him on his success in Northern Ireland and not his failure in Iraq. Is that likely to happen?
I think he will get some credit for what has happened in Northern Ireland. Indeed, I think in your introduction you described it as a patient and long process, and it certainly was that. However, I think we have to recall that many of the initial steps were already taken by the time he held office as Prime Minister. So the pattern for that was already set, and it was set in a process that was inclusive, and it was set in a process of trying to bring a community together.
But Mr. Crook, if I could interject there, I mean, the peace process failed under the Conservatives. It was confirmed under his rule. So while the Conservatives set the ball rolling, he finished it off.
I think that no one should detract from what has happened in Northern Ireland. It is really a very important achievement. So I don't think there's any point in trying to diminish anyone's particular role in it. The final outcome is a good outcome and is a positive outcome and should be acknowledged. What I'm saying is that it was a process of inclusion, and it's been a paradox that that has not been the policy that we've seen in the Middle East. And the lessons of Northern Ireland somehow don't seem to have transferred, don't seem to have, if you like, carried through or carried over to the policy that we've seen in the Middle East, particularly in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
And we're going to be talking a little bit more about that later. But Mr. AL-KHAZEN, do you think he will be judged by the failures in Iraq and his policies in the Middle East?
As an Arab, I'd say yes. I judge him by his role in the war against Iraq, by his support of the United States and Israel in opposing a ceasefire in Lebanon the last summer, while the Israeli government itself did not blame the Lebanese government of anything to do with the kidnapping of the 2 soldiers. I'm sure that most Arabs and Muslims will only judge him by his role in the Middle East, and it was really a very negative one. It led to death and destruction in our area. I cannot even separate it from the terrorism of 7/7. It did not happen in any other European country, and I link it to Tony Blair's close relationship with George Bush.
Mr. Gore, do you think his attitude towards the war in Lebanon played a large role within his own party in bringing him down?
I don't think so. I mean, I think it reinforced pressures that were already there. You know, there's a certain feeling within the Labour Party which has been growing ever since the Iraq War. The Blair had, you know, started to lead us up the wrong path in foreign policy, and I think that those fears were just reconfirmed by his response to the war in Lebanon. But I do think that, you know, the writing was already on the wall for Tony Blair long before the war in Lebanon. Once it appeared that Iraq had turned into the disaster which it, unfortunately, very sadly, it has turned into.
Mr. Crook, do you agree with that? And do you think that indicated what was happening with his relationship with the US, considering how close the US is with Israel?
Yes, I think that's correct. I think the legacy in this region, in the Middle East, is actually much more severe than people probably are ready to recognize at this point. I think our reputation, the reputation of the United Kingdom, is really at the rock bottom throughout this region. And I think it's going to take a great deal of time for this to recover. And I think we're leaving a region that is deep in multiple tensions and instability, an instability that is feeding on instability and is really in a very precarious state.
Do you think the root failure, Mr. Gore, was for him to get the Bush administration to make any sacrifices?
Yeah, no, I mean, you know, I think that is ultimately the tragedy of Tony Blair in foreign policy, is that he staked his whole case for standing shoulder to shoulder with George Bush after 9/11 on the basis that this would buy him influence in the White House. You know, you can have a debate about whether that was, you know, the right strategy, the wrong strategy. The unfortunate thing is that ultimately he hasn't really delivered on that. And I agree with you. You know, I think he almost staked his reputation and his credibility in foreign policy affairs on that basis, on being able to have an influence at the White House and to guide George Bush in a more progressive direction, which British and Europeans would be more comfortable with.
Mr. AL-KHAZEN, what do you believe Tony Blair's legacy has left on the Muslim world?
It will take a long time to forget and forgive. His attitude in taking the side of the United States in the war against Afghanistan, Taliban Afghanistan, which was really justified, was damaged with his role in the Iraqi war, and then again Lebanon last summer, which was really minor, although I'm Lebanese, compared to what's happening in Iraq. And he can't get out of it. You know, every British politician I ever spoke to would claim to me that the United Kingdom is very close in policy to the United States to be able to contain their policy and to limit the damage. But the way I see it with Tony Blair himself is that he followed the American line and did not influence it at all. In fact, he was at times, he seemed to me more keen than the Americans themselves in creating reasons for war. Remember that famous dossier and the sexing up of the dossier. Remember the 16 words in the State of the Union speech that that President Bush delivered in January 2003 about Iraq buying uranium from Niger. The original lie started in England, and it was sold to the Americans. He was at times more keen even than George Bush in pursuing the war. Even in resigning, I didn't see him apologizing to whatever happened. He said that he thought he did what was right to the country. It's obvious it wasn't right to the country at all, or to any country for that matter.
Mr. Crook, how do you think his policy of liberal interventionism will be viewed, and that is the need to intervene in other people's conflicts? I mean, will that survive him, for example, in Darfur?
I think it will not. I think it's been the real paradox of this Prime Minister that in Northern Ireland he was a reconciler. He was someone who did make big efforts to bring the communities together. Whereas in the Middle East he will be known for being involved in a series of direct interventions of supporting one faction internally against other factions. At the moment, the United States, and to an extent Europe, is involved in 6 effective civil wars: in Somalia, in Sudan, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Palestine supporting one side against another, and in Lebanon also supporting and arming one side against another. I think this polarization and this direct intervention in the internal affairs of Muslim states will be regarded as a poor legacy and a mistake.
Mr. Gore, when he took power, it was considered as the cool Britannia. What do you think the impression of Britain is going to be now?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the participants that have said earlier, that I think the reputation has been damaged. That's clear. At the same time, I think we have to be careful about, making generalizations about how Britain is viewed outside of the country, because obviously it very much depends on where you're coming from as to what your view is. Now, I accept that much of Arab opinion is opposed to Tony Blair, is opposed to the Labour Party, is opposed to Britain in some sense. That said, I'm sure that there is pockets of opinion within the Arab world that doesn't share that opinion. I don't know whether the Kurdish people, for example, would share that analysis. But certainly outside of the Middle East, there are considerable pockets of opinion around the world that wouldn't share that analysis. In Kosovo, for example, Tony Blair was welcomed as a hero for liberating the Kosovan people. I think in Sierra Leone, if you spoke to Sierra Leoneans, they may not share that point of view, let alone if you go to America, where, of course, Tony Blair has been lauded as some sort of eloquent articulator of the moral case for intervention. So I think we need to be careful about making generalizations about how Britain is viewed overseas, because it really very much depends on where that analysis is being made.
And on that note, we're going to take a short break now, but when we come back, we're going to be looking at the unlikely connection between Ireland, the Palestinian territories, and Tony Blair's legacy. Stay with us.